A young woman in simple, casual clothing approached the check-in counter, her suitcase rolling silently behind her. She was no stranger to airports, having flown across the country more times than she could count. But today felt different. There was an unsettling energy in the air that she couldn't quite place. Hidden beneath her jacket was a badge marking her as a federal officer, but to everyone around her, she was just another traveler. The airport buzzed with activity. Families rushed to their gates, business people hurried through security, and overhead announcements echoed throughout the terminal. Yet, despite the familiar chaos, she moved with a calm confidence, focused on her critical, time-sensitive mission. As she approached the counter and handed over her ticket, the attendant's expression shifted. The attendant glanced up, her gaze flicking between the ticket and the woman's face, then down to her attire. It was a subtle look, but unmistakable, an unspoken judgment that lingered too long. The officer stood still, her face composed, recognizing the look immediately. It was a familiar gaze. Too often, people didn't expect someone who looked like her, dressed like her, to hold a position of authority. This judgment crept in quietly, often unnoticed by those who delivered it, but deeply felt by those who received it. The attendant hesitated over the keyboard, her eyes darting back to the officer, taking in her jeans, plain jacket, and the absence of anything suggesting importance. The officer sensed the questions forming in the attendant's mind even before they were spoken. Was this woman supposed to be here? "Can I see some ID, please?" the attendant asked, her voice polite but tinged with doubt. The officer reached into her jacket, pulling out her government-issued ID and sliding it across the counter without a word. She had done this countless times before. It was part of the process. Usually, it was quick and efficient, but today, the attendant took the ID with hesitation, as if uncertain of its validity. The officer stood quietly, feeling the tension build. There was always a moment when someone's doubt morphed into suspicion. The attendant examined the ID, her brow furrowing slightly. The officer could see the questions forming in her mind. Questions about whether this woman could truly hold the position indicated by her credentials. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the assumptions and unconscious biases filtering through people's thoughts before they realized it. The officer knew this feeling all too well. She kept her posture steady and her expression composed, but inside she felt the weight of yet another battle she didn't want to fight. "Are you sure this is your flight?" the attendant asked cautiously, her tone uncertain. The officer replied steadily, masking her growing frustration. "Yes, I booked first class." The attendant nodded but didn't seem convinced. She glanced over her shoulder, contemplating whether to call for assistance. The officer silently observed, recognizing the shift in the attendant's body language. It was no longer a routine process, but something more. The seconds dragged on, and the officer felt the microaggressions stacking up, the avoidance of eye contact, the hesitation in accepting her information, the unspoken doubt in every glance. It was treatment that communicated without words. "You don't belong here." She had faced this before, but that didn't make it easier. "Let me check something," the attendant said, maintaining a polite tone, though her eyes betrayed suspicion. She began typing on her computer far slower than necessary, as if searching for an error that didn't exist. The officer's patience remained intact, but she felt the familiar burn of frustration beneath her calm exterior. Time was not on her side. Her mission required her across the country within hours, and every minute spent here was a delay she could not afford. She considered pulling out her badge to flash it, but hesitated. She shouldn't have to do that. Not every time. The attendant's fingers paused on the keyboard, and the officer could sense the moment stretching into eternity as she prepared for what came next. "I need to verify some details," the attendant said, her voice now carrying a slight edge. The officer clenched her jaw, recognizing the underlying issue. It wasn't about her ticket or ID, but about her appearance and the assumptions that shadowed her wherever she went. She had earned her position through years of hard work and dedication, yet all that seemed to matter now was the doubt in the attendant's eyes. More passengers queued behind her, and she could sense their impatience growing as the line inched forward. Subtle glances from other travelers hinted at their curiosity regarding the holdup. Although she maintained a calm exterior, the tension was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady yet firm. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she needed this to end quickly. She had places to be and time was slipping away. The attendant looked up, her expression guarded. "No problem, just a routine check," she replied, but the officer could tell there was more to it. She had heard those words before, used as a pretext in too many situations. Routine checks and random verifications directed at people like her. The officer kept her composure, though inside she felt weary of a battle she never chose. The attendant continued typing, her eyes filled with doubt as seconds ticked by, each adding to the discomfort. The officer thought about the badge under her jacket and how easy it would be to reveal it to end this ordeal, but she held back. She was more than her badge, more than the title she held, yet here she was again, reduced to mere appearance. The line behind her continued to grow, bringing with it an air of tension. She could feel the stares and silent judgments from those around her. What began as a simple check-in had transformed into something exhausting. Still, the officer stood firm, waiting, as that was her role. It was what she always had to do. The attendant paused, glancing hesitantly at the officer's ID before gesturing to a colleague nearby. "Can you double-check this?" she asked quietly, trying to keep the moment discreet, but the tension was palpable. The colleague approached, his expression mirroring the same skepticism. His eyes scanned the ID and shifted toward the officer with an expression that suggested her presence warranted further investigation. The officer stood still, her face calm, though inside frustration bubbled. She had clearly explained herself and provided all necessary documentation, yet she still faced suspicion. It was always the same: assumptions, judgments, and doubt, no matter how many times she encountered them. The colleague examined the ID closely, holding it up to the light as if searching for something hidden within the laminate. He frowned slightly, then looked back at the officer. "Are you sure this is the right flight?" His tone was polite, but a sharp edge lingered, as if her presence was somehow inappropriate. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied evenly. She didn't want to argue, yet the way they handled the situation forced her to feel like she needed to constantly prove herself. Every word seemed to fall on deaf ears. The colleague turned back to the attendant, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. They were deciding whether she belonged there. As they engaged in their silent conversation, she felt the growing impatience of the people in line behind her. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and a man directly behind her let out an exaggerated sigh. "What's the holdup? Is there a problem with her ticket?" His voice was loud enough to draw attention, causing the murmurs to escalate. The officer pulled in a quick breath, maintaining her outward composure, but she had been in this exact scenario too many times before. Each instance served as a reminder that no matter what she had accomplished, her appearance and presence were always questioned first, while her achievements seemed to come second. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself against the tightening tension. The colleague continued to scrutinize the ID, flipping it back and forth as if the answer to his skepticism lay hidden in the corners of the plastic. The attendant, still standing by, glanced nervously at the growing line. The passengers were no longer just murmuring, they were actively watching. A woman, a few spots back, whispered to her companion, both of them narrowing their eyes at the officer with barely concealed annoyance. The colleague handed the ID back to the attendant, yet neither made an effort to expedite the process. Instead, they exchanged another quick glance, their silent communication only adding to the officer's mounting frustration. This was becoming a spectacle, and she could feel the weight of the stares surrounding her, the silent judgments simmering into something more vocal. Another sharp sigh came from behind her. "I don't know what's going on, but this is ridiculous," the man muttered loud enough for her to hear. Embarrassment crept into her chest, not because she had done anything wrong, but due to the assumptions being made around her. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed someone subtly raising their phone, the lens directed right at her. Dread settled in the pit of her stomach. She knew how this would be interpreted. A black woman at the front of the line causing a delay. That's how it would appear in a short, contextless clip on social media. They wouldn't see the countless times she had faced this. They wouldn't know her rank, achievements, or mission. They would see only what they wanted to see. The attendant's voice broke the tension, though only slightly. "We're just verifying some details. Please bear with us." Her tone was clipped now, no longer attempting to hide her frustration. She glanced nervously at the growing line, as if the officer were the source of all the inconvenience. The colleague stood by, his expression unreadable, yet the doubt in his eyes simmered just below the surface. The officer could feel her control slipping, not in a way that would lead her to lash out, but in how every breath she took felt like a deliberate effort to remain calm. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. It was always the same, yet each time it cut a little deeper. She clenched her jaw, maintaining her steady voice as she asked, "Is there something wrong with my ticket?" She already knew the answer, but needed to remind them that she was still present. "No, the attendant replied dismissively, her tone indicating the question itself was an irritation. "We're just making sure everything is in order." But her words didn't align with her expression. There was no real problem, just an assumption that something must be wrong because of who she was.